What's up, folk? Welcome back. So today we continue on the topic of vulnerabilities, and we focus on discovery and prevention. So yeah, we continue on the topic of vulnerability analysis, and we try to understand how researchers and attackers find these vulnerabilities. And we are also going to touch about some topics on some other topics related to these security bugs. And so let's get it started. Now, last time we talked about threat model, threat modeling, attack surface, attack vector, and they really have a very big importance in the security community, and it's important to get them right. Some of these terms may appear confusing in a sense that you may find a resource that defines a term in some way and another resource that defines the term in a different way. And what I'm going to try to do now is to go over these terms once again in a slightly different light, and so that when you find them around, you have more elements to understand what the person you are listening or what the text you are reading tries to convey. Okay, so don't try to be super rigid with these definitions. Try to understand the message or the aspect that they convey, and that's the advice that I want to give. And so in the past, I have my own version, let's say, for these initial slides. Basically, I'm going to use terminology that you can find in this book, the Android Hackers Handbook. It's a bit dated. It's from some years ago, but of course, it was it's a good book. And there is this chapter number 5 that discusses about these topics. And so some of the terms and definitions, they somehow come from there. So I took their own definition. So, and again, to give you a different perspective, I want to go through these terms again and discuss how they relate to each other. All right, so we discussed about this attack vector. And again, we can see the attack vector as how an attacker makes a move. Okay, so it can discuss the methods that an attacker reaches, the methods an attacker uses to reach the vulnerable code. And some examples, you can have sending an email to the victim, and then it's not just about sending an email. You also each of these attack vector also carries some important aspects. For example, sending an email, we know that no authentication is required. I can send an email to you just by knowing your email address. But maybe to trigger a vulnerability, the user needs to read it. Okay, so it really depends on the context. What I'm trying to convey here is that when you read about an attack vector, try to get the idea. So sending an email to the victim, great, and try to understand what you can assume. For example, no authentication is required to send an email. But try to also to understand what it can be assumed or cannot be assumed. For example, whether the victim must read the message, or, for example, must enable, allow images to be loaded or not, once you try to understand what the bug is about. Okay. So, and as always, if something is not clear, then it means that you should ask the person that is describing the bug or the technique to you. Okay. Other examples are connect to an actor service. And again, this could be with or without authentication, and it depends on the scenario. It can be with or without victim involvement. Usually, there is no victim involvement in this scenario. And again, you can be more or less specific depending on the kind of stuff that whoever you're talking to is trying to convey. They're going to be more specific or not. What you really need to keep in mind is try to get the idea what the person is trying to tell you, and try to form an opinion of, or try to list the assumptions that you can give for granted, and try to characterize the attack vector that is described to you under several aspects, such as, for example, is authentication necessary, or how easy it is to access this attack vector, or how difficult it is to actually have an attacker that uses this attack vector. Okay. Again, sending an email is easier for an attacker maybe than having an attacker that is somehow connected to the same network. Okay. Cool. All right. Then there was this term of attack surface, and again, given a target, which areas are exposed to attack, and that's what somehow we convey with attack surface. Another question that is very overlapping with this is which code or component can an attacker reach? And please, try to not make confusion with all these terms. So attack surface does not depend on the attacker actions, but attack vectors do. So depending on the attack vector, you may have a specific attack surface, but it's not depending on what the attacker wants to do or not, okay? Also, it does not depend on a component containing a vulnerability. So something can be part of the attack surface even if does not contain a vulnerability, okay? So I know I'm being very repetitive, but it is my experience that this topic creates a lot of confusion among students. So that's why I'm trying to repeat the same concept that I touched on in the last lecture, just to make sure that we are on the same page, okay? Other notes about this attack surface. Well, if an attacker can reach it, then it is attack surface. That is definition of attack surface. But again, once you can be more or less specific. And again, if the attacker can reach it, so somehow, depending on the attacker the type that you have in mind, then this may characterize the attack surface, okay? And another way of saying it is that a specific attack vector can only reach specific attack surfaces. Again, attack vector X can only affect attack surface Y. A concrete example of this sentence could be, attack vector sending you an email can only affect the attack surface of, for example, the client you use to receive the emails, okay? And again, a specific type of attacker can only reach specific attack surfaces. Example, remote attacker can reach network stack attack surface. Again, the assumption is that he sends you something remotely, which means if he sends you something via email or is connected on the same network, then he can send the packet directly to the code in the kernel that parses incoming packets. And that's why you can say that a remote attacker could reach network stack attack surface. Another example is a remote attacker cannot reach the USB attack surface. Why? Well, because usually the USB is something that belongs to the physical attacker. So to reach the USB attack surface, usually we need to plug a cable in, which is not something that the remote attacker can do. Okay. So again, depending on the attacker you have in mind, this attacker kind, let's say, characterizes the attack vector that are available to this attacker, and the different attack vectors somehow characterize what kind of attack surface is available to the attacker. Okay. One important thing is that not all attack surfaces are the same. Some of them are actually riskier than others. And I would like to discuss now how can I say, or what kind of argument I may use to say that this attack surface is more problematic than another one. Okay, so there are several aspects. Again, I'm trying to do some kind of a view here like we did last time with vulnerabilities. One could say, this vulnerability is more serious than this other vulnerability. And, you shouldn't just get these sentences and just say, okay, that's true. No, you should try to reason about why is this person saying something like this, on which ground. Well, as we said last time, a vulnerability has several aspects. And depending on these aspects, then you could say, yes, this vulnerability is more serious than others. Same stuff with attack surface. Again, it seems that it seems that what I'm saying now is very similar to this vulnerability characterization, but keep in mind, attack surface is independent from a code component having a vulnerability. That's a discussion that you can have even if you are not aware of any bug in your code, okay? Okay, I hope this is clear. So in terms of characterizing attack surface, how can we know whether an attack surface is more difficult or more risky than another one? Well, the first one aspect is the attack vector. How easy or difficult it is to trigger a potential bug in this attack surface. And does the user need to be involved to reach it? Be involved to reach it usually means, if I send you an email, do you expect the user to click on the email, to open it, to load the images? Or if the attack vector is a phone call, do you expect the user to answer the phone call, or just by doing a phone call, then the attacker starts and works? The other thing is, does it require authentication or not? You have many of these questions, and given an attack vector, some attack vectors may be more practical than others. The other aspect is the privilege gained, in a sense that, let's say you have a specific attack surface and you have a piece of code in this attack surface, well, with which privilege this code is actually running. And this makes a lot of difference, right? If this piece of code reachable in this attack surface is running in kernel space, it's of course more problematic with respect to a piece of code that is running in a restricted sandbox, okay? Again, this somehow overlaps with the thing about vulnerability, like, oh, if you find a vulnerability in kernel space, is more dangerous than a vulnerability in a restricted sandbox, in the general case. But you can, say the same, this aspect is important also when characterizing attack surface. That's the main point that I'm trying to make here. Other aspects, memory safety. If your attack surface is written in C++, then it's more likely to contain exploitable bugs. Because if your attack surface is written in Java, you can already exclude that there are buffer overflows there. Okay. Complexity. Is this attack surface including code that is very complex, such as, for example, code that parses complex data structures? If yes, that historically is actually more likely to contain bugs. If it's like a sorting algorithm, is less likely to contain bugs with respect to a parser of some kind of custom complicated file format. Okay. This is more knowledge that comes from experience. Like historically, more bugs have been found in parsers with respect to a binary search algorithm. But it's also there is also an intuition behind this. The more complicated the code is, the more complicated the actually writing the code was for the developer, and the more complicated structures maybe the code needs to use to implement the whatever the code needs to implement. And this, of course, complexity leads to different bugs. Okay. Another interesting aspect that maybe you didn't think about is popularity of the piece of code that is you are trying to characterize in the attack surface. For example, does the piece of code implement a poorly known old archaic protocol and that is there just for backward compatibility reasons? Believe it or not, if this is something poorly known, old, and it's just there from the past and people forgot about it, it's slightly more likely to contain bugs with respect to code that is well known. Why? Because usually if the code is well known, it means that probably it's fuzzed better. We will touch on what fuzzing means later, but it has been analyzed better. It has been investigated by many more eyes. And maybe if you have an old component that nobody cares about, well, maybe less people checked it out, and it could be that there are more bugs there. Of course, when I say that an old component is more likely to contain bugs, doesn't mean really that if you take an old component, then it's more, is more likely to contain bugs. It's like a parity of complexity, memory safety, and all these things. Then if a code is less, if a component is less popular, then it's more likely relatively to the other components to contain bugs. Okay, none of this is actually, if you have this, then for sure it's all relative. Okay, and so I'm just saying here that once you have an attack surface, there are a number of aspects, and then you should try to consider each of these aspects and keep them into account when trying to understand what kind of attack surface is more dangerous than others. What happens in most cases is not that you can say attack surface X is strictly more risky than attack surface Y. You can have situations like this. For example, attack surface in C is strictly more risky than attack surface Y. Well, in the general case, you may have this argument, but in general, it's not very important to have these strict comparisons. It's just that, these are aspects to keep in mind. Okay. All right. Cool. So there are different types of attack surfaces, and you're going to see some kind of a some kind of analogy with the terminology I used last time. These are terms taken from this Android Hacker's Handbook, and this book describes a number of different attack surfaces, but you're going to find an analogy between these terms, like remote attack surface, like physical adjacency, local attack surface, and so forth, with what we discussed last time, which was you have a remote attacker, you have a local attacker, you have a proximal attacker, and so forth. This last was terminology used by, for example, Google. The difference here is that in one case, last time we discussed about the kind of attacker type that you had in mind. So you assume an attacker that can do this and that. While in this case, we discussed about the attack surface. So of course there is a relation. A attack type X can reach attack surface Y, but they're not the same thing, okay? So my point for these slides is clearly there is an overlap in terms of, typology of things, like, physical adjacency or remote attack surface, local attack surface. But I felt it was very important to really stress out that there is some kind of analogy or kind of similar terminology, but we're discussing about different things. One is about attacker assumption. The other thing is about attack surface, which is parts of code that are actually reachable by an attacker. And of course, there is a relation, but they're not the same thing. I know I'm being very annoying. So if you're actually watching this on YouTube and you know a thing or two about security, this is probably super boring. But again, in my previous experience, there were a lot of confusion about these topics. So I really want to do my best to clarify this. Cool. So going through quickly about these attack surfaces, these types of attack surfaces. So the first one here is this remote attack surface. And again, these are attack surfaces that are reachable usually by a remote attacker. So we have the network stack, exposed network services, SMS, browser, web-enabled, mobile apps, and so forth, okay? Or media processing, and so forth. Again, try to understand media processing. Why is remote attack surface? Well, because if I send you a message with a picture, somebody needs to parse this picture, and that's where the media processing code kicks in, okay? You should be able to understand these kind of things. And you should be able to understand why, for example, media processing fits under the remote attacker surface. Remote attack surface. Cool. Other examples are physical adjacency or proximal attacker, and we have things like GPS, baseband, Bluetooth. So kind of a Wi-Fi or NFC, kind of a piece of code that could be triggered by an attacker that is physically next to you. And again, for these kind of things like baseband and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi or NFC, think about this. I mean, the attacker really needs to be next to you to somehow play with code on your device that belongs to this Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and so forth. Local attack surface, basically we have things like the file system, system call, sockets, binder, shared memory, and so forth. And these are about usually there's surfaces that are available to a piece of code locally on the phone. So you have a piece of code already running on the phone, and then this piece of code, what kind of attack surface can reach? Well, this is the list, okay? And the last one that I have here is physical attack surface, and it is about, not only you need to be physically near to the attacker, but like we have in this physical adjacency or proximal attacker case, but you actually need to be, you actually need to have the phone in your hands, and under this attack surface, you have things an attacker can do once he can open the phone apart, so he can play with the hardware, or plug a USB, or try to have ADB access. Okay. Cool. Let me move up myself. Okay. Again, these types of attacks are very coarse-grained, and some attack surfaces within the same type can be strictly better than others. Examples. Consider two examples in the remote attack surface category. If you can have a browser attack surface, like the user needs to click on a link. So I send an email to you, or I send you a message on WhatsApp or on Signal to a link, and then to trigger the bug, maybe the user needs to click on the link. Consider another scenario, a network stack attack surface where no user interaction is required. I just need to send you a message, and then the piece of code that just interprets the packet coming from the network is able to trigger the bug. Then of course this bug is much better than the one where the user needs to click on something. Okay, so again, these are two examples in the remote attack surface, but one is better than the other. Okay, cool. So what I'm trying to say here is that sure, there are these very coarse-grained categories, and these categories are great, and they're great for discussing with people and so forth. But it's not that you know, it's enough to say, okay, this attack surface belongs to this one, and thus this is better than this. You know, there are different hierarchies within these attack surfaces. So depending on the context, depending on the discussion, depending on if it's just an informal discussion about, oh, what can attacker do, or maybe you're reading a paper about a specific bug, then you may want to go in a finer grained analysis of what this kind of attack surface is intending to mean. Okay, so another aspect is these goals. Attackers exploiting different attack surfaces usually have different goals in mind. For example, for a remote attacker or a proximal or physical attacker, usually the attacker wants to get some sort of code execution on the device. Okay, and again, in this kind of attacker, the attacker is not already running some code. So, you know, remote attacker is really far, proximal is around the phone but not really attached. Even if you have the phone, you know, there is a lock screen maybe, and you cannot really install another application, run code. So usually the goal is to just get code executed there. For a local attacker, you know, you're assuming already there is a code executing on the device. So usually the goal here is to perform privilege escalation. Somehow try to get code execution in a higher privilege component. Again, because the attacker here is already assumed to have limited code execution. Okay, so try to keep this in mind when, you know, once somebody telling you about an attack surface, then usually there are different goals. And since there are different goals, you may be interested in different kind of bugs when looking at specific attack surface. Okay, so threat model. We discussed threat model already last time, and you know, this is all the aspects we talked about up to now. They were framed under, you know, threat model and threat modeling, and I want to go, since, you know, since this is super important topic, I want to spend some few words on how this threat model and threat modeling relate to what we discussed today. Okay, so threat model is basically, you know, as we said last time, is a list of assumptions when discussing about attack and defense. And for attacks, so once I have a threat model, so the list of assumptions I can have, for attacks, the idea is that you can assume an attacker that is not more powerful than X. Okay, for defenses, I assume an attacker that is at least as powerful as X. When I want to say, you know, I have a defense system that can protect you from this. Okay. Now, given a threat model, usually you can have questions like, which attack vector are, you know, we considering as feasible, or which components are actually attack surfaces. So just to, you know, rephrase it, the point of these 2-3 slides that I have here is to make sure that we can relate terms like threat model and threat modeling, which we discussed somehow last time, with the new terms that we discussed today, which are attack vector and attack surfaces. Okay, so given a threat model, you may want to ask yourself, what attack vectors should I consider? And given a threat model, you may want to ask yourself, given, you know, this threat model, what components are actually belonging to a reachable attack surface. Okay. Then we have this threat modeling, and again, threat modeling is and again, I don't think I discussed this last time, what this threat modeling is. So threat model is really a list of assumptions. Okay, if I tell you my attack works under this threat model, it means that my attack works if I assume this and this and this. Okay, if I have a defense that works under this threat model, it means my defense is reliable as long as this assumption works. Threat modeling is different. Threat modeling is the process of evaluating and answering questions such as, what would an attacker like to steal or do with our infrastructure? Or what are the possible attack surfaces? Or which attack vectors should we consider? Rephrased, threat modeling is the analysis of what could possibly go wrong. So in the past, with this, oh, my attack works under this threat model, somehow you're having this threat model, you know, from the sky. Somebody's telling you, oh, my attack works under this threat model, or my defense works under this threat model. But once you have something to defend from, you know, a system, an infrastructure, a telephone, or things like this, then, you know, it's not that you have a specific attack and you have a specific threat model. Usually you want to ask yourself, okay, what kind of a threat model, what kind of threat models I should consider to consider my infrastructure or my company safe. Okay, so again, threat modeling is this kind of analysis to understand, given the situation. Again, the situation could be I have a phone or I have a company with many servers around. Threat modeling helps understanding which threat model should be considered. Okay. Once you have a list of things you should consider, then you can think about the risk posed by an attacker X and the security of a defense system X. In the sense that if you have threat modeling gives you a list of relevant threat models, then for each of these threat models, you can say, okay, under this threat model, can somebody use attack X? Or under this threat model, my defense, is it enough or not? And then you should do this for every threat model you have in mind. Okay. So again, threat model is this generic term to convey the mental exercise of going through what could possibly go wrong and which attacks are powerful to attack you and which defense systems are enough to defend you. All right, I hope that was enough. All right, so at this point, I hope I convinced you that not all bugs have the same importance. So I really, really try my best to convey, there are vulnerabilities, but they're all not all the same. There are tons of different aspects to consider, and vulnerabilities may affect different attack surfaces, and attack surfaces are not the same. There are different aspects to convey, blah, 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 okay? And I really hope that I convey to you how one can judge whether an attack is problematic or not. Well, check the threat model. Should I care about the threat model? Well, threat modeling gives you a list of what you should consider it or not. Now, what I want to explore here is how to proceed when we want to find them. So now we are basically the researchers or the attackers, and we have a piece of code or a piece of a framework, Android framework, or an application, and somehow we want to find these bugs. And the other question, so how do they do this? What is the procedure? What's the mentality? The other question I want to explore here is whether attackers always need to find new bugs. Okay, can somebody use old bugs? Well, old bugs are old bugs. So old somehow means that they are old, so they are known. And shouldn't known bugs be fixed? So I have some slides on these topics. I actually am gonna answer the second questions first, and old bugs can actually be okay. So if you have an old bug and this bug is not patched, then of course old bugs is absolutely fine. Okay. This hope that you can have that the bugs is not patched or not depends on the target, and it's actually a complex topic. Like if you have Android, you know that the Android is actually patched every month, right? But is Android patched with all the bugs that are known at that point in time? Well, yes and no. In a sense, there could be bugs, for example, affecting Linux that are somehow known to the Linux community and they are already fixed in the latest Linux version. But maybe the patches for these bugs has not been ported yet to Android. And even if these bugs are known, if you check in the Linux source code, they are actually not patched in the latest monthly bulletin. Okay, so whether something is fully patched, whether something is patched, it's trickier to reply to this question, because depending on the product, it can be patched. They patch some bugs, but even the last version doesn't mean it is fully patched against all bugs that are known to the community. Okay. When attackers use known bugs, usually these are called end days. Okay. The other term is 0 day. Basically, 0 day usually it's a bug that is not known before I tell you that there is a bug there. So that's called a 0 day, a bug that was previously undisclosed, and the zero comes from the 0 days since I disclosed this bug. End day means that this bug was disclosed n day ago, and n days or n months and whatever ago, but is not being fixed yet, and so I can use this n day to exploit the system. Okay. So long story short, depending on the situation, an attacker may use old bugs that somebody has discovered. They say there is no honor among thieves, so that applies here as well. Okay, if there is a system you need to hack and you have a old bug that somebody has found it, of course people are going to use it to exploit your system. The other thing is that maybe these end days are not, maybe they are not public, but they're somehow known in some parts of the community. And so you have these situations where, or maybe, the bug is not known to anybody except for some specific researchers or companies. So one could call them 0 days because the community doesn't know about them. But attackers don't need to necessarily find these bugs themselves. There are researchers that find these bugs, and these researchers sometimes sell bugs to companies or to governments, and then attackers could buy bugs from these companies. Okay, so there is a kind of a huge market for these things. So what I'm trying to say here is that if an attacker wants to hack you, doesn't mean that it needs to find bugs himself or herself. He can buy bugs somewhere else. All right, so now going back to the first question, that is, if we need to find bugs, how do we start? Where do we start? So the questions are that you need to look at, that you need to answer when you look at a piece of code. So, you take the app, let's say that it's an app, it could be the operating system, and then before you try to find bugs there, you need to really answer a bunch of questions. And these questions are, is it used? The point here is, if you have a piece of code, in your application that is not used at all, well, even if there is a bug there, then it doesn't matter, right? If there is a bug there, but the code is never used, it's that code, then whatever. The attacker will never be able to reach it by definition because it's not used. And if that's the case, it means that looking at this piece of code doesn't really make sense. You're losing your time. So even if you find the bug, it doesn't make sense. Second question is it accessible to an attacker? So rephrased, is this piece of code somehow part of the attack surface that I should consider giving my threat model? If the answer is no, then we are back into the attacker will not be able to reach it. Okay, so if you are a local attacker, then maybe checking the code that handles the USB interaction maybe doesn't make any sense, because for the kind of assumptions that you have in mind, which is a local attacker, the USB code will never be triggered. It is used because there is, of course, a scenario where it's used, like when I plug my USB cable in. But in terms of a local attacker, it will never be used. Okay, so the second question is very important. Here is, you should check code and you should try to find bugs in code that is part of the attack surface that you consider. Which attack surface should be considering? Well, it depends on your threat model. If you only care about remote attackers and you don't care about local privilege escalations, then, for example, all these attack surface that is the list of syscodes that an application can invoke, maybe you don't care. You should focus only on the syscodes that the remote attacker can trigger. Okay, so that's how the threat model helps you defining what is attack surface, and the attack surface tells you what kind of code you should focus on. Okay, cool. The third question, of course, is vulnerable or not. So once you have the attack surface, if you find a bug there, maybe relevant, maybe triggerable, maybe reachable by an attacker, and of course you need to figure out if it's vulnerable or not. So to be systematic, usually what people do is the following. So these three questions are about a piece of code, but how can you, what kind of piece of code do you start from? Well, to be systematic, you should follow 3 steps. First is attack surface enumeration. So let's say that you try to solve the last homework, the upper exploitation stuff. Well, try to first do the attack surface enumeration. In my homework, the system, it works at this point. You have a target app that is installed on an emulator, and then you have your own application, that is the attacker, that is installed on the same emulator, and then your application needs to somehow attack my application and steal the flag. Now, attack surface enumeration in this context would be, the attacker is another app also on the same device, and he can try to interact with the target app. So for example, activities that process intents, or activities or components that are exported, so reachable by another application on the phone, well, these guys actually fit under they're part of the attack surface. Okay, every piece of code that is reachable from this exported component is also part of the attack surface. So in general, every piece of code that is reachable by an attacker, where the attacker in this case is another app on the phone, is part of the attack surface. And so this attack surface enumeration is the process through which the attacker, in this case you, take my app, the target app, and tries to list which functionality are actually reachable from the attacker. And if you find a functionality that is not reachable at all from the attacker, you can discard it. If it's reachable, then it's fair game, and you should consider it when you try to figure out where there are bugs. Okay. Then, for these homeworks, they're quite easy. So these apps are not gigantic, but real attackers usually want to attack, big apps or big framework, Android framework, entire operating system. So, you need to choose where to start. And again, I hope I convey that not all these attack surfaces are the same in terms of importance, in terms of how risky it is, that there are bugs and so forth. And so what you should do usually is to try to focus on the best attack surface. What is the best one? Well, check the aspects we discussed. The best usually for an attacker is how likely it is that I'm going to find a bug in this component. And again, this could be something about the complexity of the code. Is it written in C++? Is it a popular piece of code? And so forth. Or even if I find a bug there, is it reachable? What kind of component? What's the privilege of the component that runs the piece of code? And so forth. Okay. Once you select the best attack surface, then go in and try to find the bug there. So now I have more content on how to find bugs there. Okay. But okay, that's the process. All right. I think this slide, I spoiled it completely with what I said before. So let's make sure I discuss everything. So attack surface enumeration, what are the possible attack surfaces? And again, this process is independent from whether there are bugs or not. Okay, so when we do attack surface enumeration, we're just listing all the possible parts of the code that are reachable by an attacker, but we don't know yet whether there is a bug or not. Okay, and I really stress in this because attack surface does not relate to whether there are bugs or not. And then in terms of selecting the best attack surface, that's how you should prioritize them. So for example, that's a concrete example on how you can select the best, and it can be reached with an attack vector that has the least number of requirements. Again, it's not only remote attacker vs local attacker or remote attack surface vs local attack surface. Even if you focus on one specific category, there are different attacks, and not all these have the same practicality. So focus on the ones with least assumptions, least number of assumptions in terms of practicality. Select something that runs with high privileges, written in memory and safe language, complex code base, blah, blah, blah. Okay. All right. I hope this is clear. Let's move on. And now let's discuss a bit how to find these bugs. Of course, there is no recipe that works for all cases. You could consider this as an art. It's not easy stuff, and there is no specific procedure. But of course, there are patterns on how you can find these bugs. And again, these slides are a brief discussion of the main aspects you should consider. Okay, it's a very vast and very active research area. There are hundreds of papers published in top conferences, both academic and industry, on this topic. So do not expect that what I'm saying is valid forever. These are just some starting points, and it's impossible for me to summarize them completely. So these are really just starting points, and then my hope is that you find some terms interesting, and then you Google for them, or you ask me a question, and I'm going to direct you to the proper, more advanced information. Okay. So again, the goal here is not to be completely, just to provide a kind of overview about what's going on in the community. Okay. So these research areas usually try to answer different questions. One is how to prioritize which parts to look at. Can we write tools to help us out? As we are going to discuss, there is a manual analysis where most of the effort is done manually. And, maybe you can write tools to remove some part of the manual part so that you can, automate things and doing them in a faster way. Can we find bugs in a completely automatic way? How? Maybe you can feed random inputs. You can trace data flows to see what can attacker reach, or you can simulate all possible executions. Each of these questions usually generates many papers. So there are papers that try, many papers that try to answer maybe a specific question, okay? So of course there is no answer to this, there is no specific answer to this question, and just, let's say that we want to trace the input that go from outside, from the attacker to the app, and let's say we want to understand how this input is actually processed by the app. There are many, many papers on this specific topic, okay? Then, assuming that we managed to send an input that crashes the system, are we done? Well, if the goal was to do denial of service, yeah, yes, we are done, because maybe the system crashes and then, that's already, we fulfilled our goal. But maybe the bug was to actually get code execution. So how can we move from a test case that somehow crashes the app to a test case that actually gets code execution? And this is the pattern of automatic exploitation. Okay, so given a crashing bug, can we write an exploit automatically? Again, many papers on the topic. Another thing is let's say that we have a technique that somehow gives us a lot of test inputs that crash a specific program. Are all crashes related to different bugs, or are all crashes related to the same underlying bug? Answering these questions again is explored in many different papers. So that just to convey that it's not a simple question, and there are many papers just trying to answer each of these, a single one of this question. This is just to convey it's really, really vast and active research area, and these are just starting points. If you feel something is particularly interested to you, please reach out. I will be very happy to direct you to the right information, the right papers, and the right people. Okay. So again, each of these questions is a research topic per se, and there are many techniques. Maybe they try to answer a specific question, and there are usually pros and cons. Okay. Some techniques, depending on the case, some techniques appear to work better than others, and but is it because the technique is superior, or because the types of bugs that we are finding is of specific kind? So it's sometimes one could think that these techniques work well because the current bugs are shallow. For example, there are you can have a very basic fuzzing approach, and again I have slides on what fuzzing is and so forth later on, but the idea is that you feed a target program with random input, and then you hope that the target crashes, which means that you maybe found some memory corruption. And this stuff actually works. But can it be that it works because these bugs that we are finding are very shallow, and once we found all the shallow bugs, then this fuzzing technique doesn't work anymore? Well, yes, it could be. And so this fuzzing principle of sending something random still kind of works, but maybe just applying this blindly as it would be in 20 years ago, it doesn't work anymore. Maybe you need to somehow direct these random things in a better way, or start from something more specific and then you do small variations. So again, there are many research papers trying to take some technique, and maybe technique doesn't work anymore, and you refine this technique so that now it works again on more difficult to find bugs. Okay. This is just to say that it's also very tricky to understand whether a technique is actually better than the other. And it's also an active research area. Try to understand whether two proposed techniques in two research papers are actually, the second one is better than the other one. Okay, it turns out it's very, very difficult to create a benchmark to find, to properly compare these techniques. So even creating a benchmark turned out to be very difficult, and there are research papers trying to create benchmarks and so forth. Okay, so very, very vast research area. One of the things that people start with is manual analysis, and for the homeworks, manual analysis is going to be okay for you. These apps are actually very small, so it's not going to be a problem. And the idea in manual analysis is that you do most of the job manually. Of course, you use tools for basic things like disassembly, the compilation, source code browser, CFG analysis, call graph, type definition. It's not that manual analysis means to do everything manually. But there are some tools that are very, very stable and do simple things that are very, well understood. So manual analysis usually involves using these tools. But these tools usually allow you to go around the code, to explore it better, to reverse it better, but they don't find you the bug automatically. And so that's where the manual component kicks in, okay? And again, you know, this manual analysis, usually it's going around and checking this piece of code and asking yourself many questions like, you know, is this piece of code reachable? Or how big is this buffer? And, you know, can I send something that's bigger than this? You know, is the classic thing of asking yourself questions. And in many, many cases, the answer is no, false alarm, I cannot do anything. But at some point, you may find something weird. And, you know, this moment when you ask, oh, what if I do this? And in some cases, that's the thing. So you find something weird, and this triggers a bunch of questions in your mind. And maybe, you know, once you ask these questions to you yourself, it's not that you know, okay, this is a bug for sure. But you know, once you find these bugs, you're gonna find some kind of a pattern where you know, okay, this is weird. What about this? And what about this? But what if I do this? And what if I do this? And sometimes you finally arrive to complete the final chain, and you're really able to achieve your goal by chaining together all these weird things. Okay. And then that's more or less it in terms of a manual analysis or manual source and binary code review. Okay. You check it until you find something weird, and then you keep pushing. And if this, you know, you take notes, and if a specific route doesn't work out, well, keep these notes into account, because maybe this specific route didn't work out, but maybe some weirdness that you found is actually useful to complete the exploit. And, you know, but this route didn't work, okay, try to find another route. These homeworks are very simple because you know there is a bug there, because I have test cases to exploit them automatically. So for sure, there is a way to attack them. And this gives you mental confidence that the bug is there. But once you need to attack real code, there is a huge barrier usually to start with, because of course we are not sure that there are bugs there. So it becomes much more complicated than what an homework or what playing on a war game site could be. The other thing is this automatic analysis, and you have a number of techniques: static analysis, taint analysis, symbolic execution, and I have a set of slides for, I think, next class discussing these techniques. So don't worry if you don't understand these terms, that's fine. But the idea is that there are different techniques, and then usually, given the type of bug you're trying to find, then you develop a program analysis technique that is tailored to find this specific bug. And maybe this tailored technique could follow under a label such as static analysis or taint analysis and so forth. But then it's rare that a static analysis tool finds all the bugs for you. Okay, so the static analysis, taint analysis, and so forth are usually categories of automatic program analysis techniques. So tools that analyze the program and try to do something with it, try to extract information, and usually depending on a target of class vulnerability, then you write your analysis to find the specific thing. Okay, and again, many research papers on all the different kind of class vulnerabilities. So for basically every vulnerability I discussed in the past, permission leak, content hijacking, or component hijacking, principal release privilege, bugs in UI stuff, or SMS things, SSL pinning, crypto things. For all these kind of bugs, usually there are papers of dynamic code loading, remote, for each kind of bug, class of bugs, usually there is a paper trying to say, I wrote an approach based on static analysis, and with these tricks, I'm able to find this kind of bugs. And all the papers that I've cited in the past that I referenced somehow fit in this category. Okay, so a big relevant research area is how to develop program analysis techniques that can automatically find bugs in this category. Okay, again, I don't want to spend too much time on these specific things because I have slides and content later on the road. But I want to talk about the second big category, which is fuzzing. Again, I'm describing this as category 1, category 2, but in many cases nowadays they are mixed up. You can do a bit of static analysis to then drive the fuzzing technique and vice versa. So don't be too strict in interpreting this. But at the core, there are two techniques, two category techniques, let's say. but it doesn't mean that you cannot mix them, and actually people mix them nowadays, okay? So back to fuzzing, this is the focus of the next slide, so let's get to it. What is fuzzing? So fuzzing is an automated process, and the idea here is to throw a lot of different test inputs against your target, okay? And these test inputs are intentionally malformed, and the idea is that at a certain point, maybe one of these random test input makes your target crash. And at this point, you're very happy because maybe you triggered, you found, a normal application should not crash. So if something crashed, maybe it means that there was a memory corruption vulnerability bug that you somehow managed to use to crash the application. Of course, one question is, okay, given a crash, can the test input be modified even further to get code execution? Again, there are many research papers trying to go from, given a crash, can I know if this crash is a crash due to a bug that is that is exploitable? So these are very difficult questions to answer in the general case, but that's where the human maybe kicks in the sense that once you have a crash, then you try to triage, you try to understand where this crash comes from, where is the bug, what kind of bug is it, in which component, and so forth, okay? Of course, this technique doesn't guarantee you anything, and depending on how you malform the input, then you may have success or not. For example, if you have an image parser, usually image formats always have checksum, okay? So, and if the checksum is not correct for a specific, part of the payload, then the parser doesn't even kick in the sense that they check the checksum, the checksum doesn't match, bam, it's malformed and it gets rejected. Maybe the interesting part of the parser gets triggered after the checksum part is passed. So that's where the human needs to be a bit smart and say, okay, maybe the fuzzer should generate random test inputs, but the checksum should be correct. So you change something and then you fix the checksum. Alternatively, one other trick is that you take the code that parses the image, for example, and then you comment out the part that actually checks the checksum, so that even if your test case has the wrong checksum, still the interesting part of the code is reached. I'm saying this just an example, but this should convey that it's not just some, fuzzing is not blind stuff, or I automatically create these random test cases and so forth. But usually what happens in this process is that the human tries to be smart about it, tries to make sure that these random test inputs are available, that they trigger interesting code, and so forth, okay? The power of this fuzzing is that you can generate automatically these test inputs, and you can be very fast in doing so, and you can be very fast in trying to run, try to run each of these test cases, which could be many, thousands, against your target in a very small amount of time, okay? And that's something that manually you could not do, okay? Again, there are many different flavors. How are the different test inputs generated? Tons of research papers on how to generate these inputs. There are some other fuzzing approaches that generate something random, and then you see what kind of code this triggers, and then you say, I like, then you change something random again, and you say, now I went to another place, so interesting, I want to remain in this other place. So now this part, I don't change it anymore, I change something else. So sometimes, usually there is a feedback loop where you generate something random, you execute it, you see what happened in terms of code coverage, for example, and given this information about the code coverage, then you say, okay, I don't like where I went, then I change this back, or I change something else. Okay, there is some kind of feedback loop that informs the random generator on how we should generate things. And again, there are tons of research papers on, what should be the aspect that should be optimized? Should it be code coverage in terms of basic blocks that you covered? Should it be state coverage, where basically you keep reaching the same basic blocks, but the context or for example, the values and global variables is changed, and so I'm still okay with it. There are many different papers trying to argue you should optimize this or you should optimize that, and again, very vast research area. There are hundreds of research papers on the topic, And one of the main tools that really made history in the past is called American Fuzzy Loop, AFL. You know, this is, I actually don't remember how old it is, 15 or so, 15 years ago or something like this. It's very old. And, you know, nowadays, my understanding is that, you know, people don't use it anymore, but there are many approaches based on this, okay? There is, you know, there are many variations. There is, you know, a bunch of plugins. There is a project called AFL++, which somehow is a, you know, the current version of AFL plus the more interesting plugins. And but you know, that's the one that really kicked off the fuzzing research trend, let's say. And fuzzing is so useful that Google hosts this OS Fuzz, which is basically a service to fuzz, you know, continuously open source software. And it really found hundreds of bugs in popular software. Okay, and you know, depending on the software, these bugs could be very valuable. You know, it's Google is really invested, and many other companies are invested, and there is really this huge push in fuzzing and how to find better strategies to fuzz. And again, very powerful thing, very open research area. If you are serious into this vulnerability discovery, then fuzzing is really a topic you should master. There are 5 steps once you want to perform fuzzing on a specific target, or you know, when you need to find bugs. Again, I found these steps from the book, so I refer you back to this book. Or if if you are interested in a specific aspect, let me know. I'm gonna redirect you to the proper resources. You know, some steps: finding a target, generating input, processing the input, crash monitor, blah. Next slides are about this topic, so no spoiler, let's go through them. So the first point is to identify a target. That's what we discussed in the previous slides. So attack surface enumeration, and then, okay, I have many attack surfaces, which one should I pick? And you decide depending on what's best for you. You know, should maximize for likelihood of finding bugs, or what's the impact, how easy it is to reach this piece of code, and so forth. Okay. Once you have this target, then you need to you need to generate a bunch of inputs automatically. And the idea is to generate them slightly malformed, so to trigger some maybe corner cases. Okay. And the idea is that, again, you generate them, malform them in a malformed way with the hope to trigger and thus discover security vulnerabilities. And in fuzzing, there is this concept that is the mutation. That is, you know, you start usually with one or more seeds, which is a file or an input that is somehow valid, that is somehow parsed by the target. So, you know, if you have an image file parser, for example, the first 4 bytes should be a specific 4 bytes, the magic, the magic number, or the specific header. If these bytes are not exactly what the parser expects, the parser doesn't do anything. And it would be a pity to lose crazy amount of time just by brute forcing these 4 bytes. You know, they need to be these specific 4 bytes. So one technique is you take a file that is valid, and then you start from this one and you start mutating it. Okay, so that, for example, these 4 bytes are already legitimate. So as long as you don't touch these 4 bytes, you don't need to brute force them. You can just leave them there, and that's it. And then that's where, you know, you generate a random mutation, and then somehow the fuzzer understand, hey, I changed this, and then this one brought me much farther, so I like it, I'm gonna keep this. Or, for example, I changed this other byte. This could be, for example, one of these bytes in the magic parts of the header, and the code coverage was very bad. And it could be because maybe you change one byte in the header, the parser didn't do anything, and then the fuzzer understands, oh, you know, if I change this byte, then nothing of interest is actually reached, so I'm gonna keep it the same. So somehow this feedback loop is used to understand what to change or not, and the idea is that these fuzzers try to try to reach the deep parts of the code. Again, as I'm repeating many times, there are many papers trying to be smarter about how to reach this deep part, mixing, static analysis or symbolic execution and things like this. But you get the idea, okay? So there can be smarter fuzzers than others, but the idea is the same. You mutate something to reach something else, to reach a new state, a new piece of code that you didn't reach before. I think this is something I already mentioned. So conceptually, you can have this dumb fuzzing and smart fuzzing. Dumb fuzzing, you basically mutate stuff really almost randomly, and you don't consider anything about what the actual input was. You don't consider, oh, this was part of the header. You don't consider, oh, this was the size of a buffer, so or some data part, so I try to change it. They don't care. Smart fuzzing, that's where the human somehow contributes a bit of their intuition on what kind of input should be changed in the file. Some file parts are maybe more prone to lead to a corner case in the parser, and that smart fuzzing basically somehow tries to include this knowledge into the fuzzer or the mutation algorithm. Okay. There are also, again, many research papers on how to automatically include this knowledge into the mutation algorithm. And there are so-called generative methods where basically you start, for example, it's a grammar base. Somehow you define the grammar of the file format that should be parsed from something, and then you start from this grammar, and automatically you generate files that somehow respect this grammar. Okay, maybe this grammar is going to be a bit more flexible than the real grammar of the file, with the hope that by generating a file that is somehow respecting this more flexible grammar, you're going to trigger a corner case in the parser. But you get the idea. And the other thing is, once you basically take this test and you randomly generate this test, then you need to send them to the target. And again, the way you do this really depends on the attack surface. For example, if you need to fuzz a media file parser, what you could do is to open the input file with the parser, with the library, and see what happens. If you need to fuzz a network component, then maybe what you want to do is to open a connection and send the input and see what happens. Or of course, you could be smarter about this. For example, for sure you can fuzz a network component by opening a connection and sending input. But maybe what you could do is to somehow take this network component, try to isolate the code part that handles the network connection, and then somehow do everything locally. Instead of opening a connection, you somehow take your random data, your list of inputs, and you somehow feed them to this component that processes the input you send, but without opening a connection. Why? Well, because the point of fuzzing is that you want to be super fast, and you can be super fast, but opening a connection is very, it's introducing a large overhead. So what you could do is to cut that part, you keep everything locally so that you can boost the performance of the fuzzer. So again, there are many tricks like this, and depending on the context, there are more tricks, many of which I don't know. So really, depending on what you want to do, you should really Google for it, try to find more information. It's a huge research field. I don't have any pretense of being, claiming myself as an expert in this topic. The goal of the slides is just to give you an overview of what's going on in the community, so that if you find something interesting, you can reach out to me, and I'm going to try to help you out and put you in communication with the people that actually know much more than me. Or you can be more autonomous and Google for something, try to find yourself these research papers, try to read more, and so forth. Okay, these are more starting points than, oh, that's how things are. Okay, so once you take these inputs and once you process them, so you find them and you send them against your target, then there is an aspect that is the crash monitoring. You want to somehow understand whether the target actually crashed or not. So if you have a C program or some kind of a component that may have memory related problems, one aspect usually is to monitor for segmentation faults. Okay. In Android, what you could do is to check the logs. Whenever something crashes, there is a log being generated. Is there any stack trace being dumped in the logs? Or is the system service rebooting? Or you start seeing some kind of this ANR, which should be application not responding messages. If yes, maybe you are triggering something that is interesting in terms of some kind of bugs that you're going to find, that you're finding. Or is the phone itself rebooting? If this stuff happening, then maybe you're actually found something interesting. Okay. Again, depending on the scenario, you may need to have different techniques. So for example, is the phone rebooting? Doesn't make any sense in the context of fuzzing a parsing image parsing library. Okay, if you need to fuzz an image parsing library, you just need to take this library, you keep sending things, you keep calling the function parse image, and then you check if this guy is segfaulting, right? It is phone rebooting, maybe it's more meaningful when you have an application and you try to really shoot to a lot of services running on the phone. And in that case, maybe it's a good signal if the phone reboots. Okay, so again, don't take this as a super strict, oh, that's how it's done. These are more foods for thoughts on how people do it. And depending on your scenarios, there may be better ways of doing things. And okay, and then last step is once you have a crash, is it an actual security bug? At this point, you want to understand better whether a crash is actually related to a bug that is actually security related, or it's a bug that is not really exploitable. Like in many cases, null dereference is not exploitable. So many bugs are triggered by this, and you want to somehow understand whether the bug that you have, the crash that you have, is actually a security bug or not. And at this point, there are many techniques such as code instrumentation, debugging, or whatever we discussed so far that could kick in and be helpful. And usually the useful steps to understand whether a bug is security, a crash is coming from a security bug or not, is to try to determine the root cause. What is the piece of code that somehow allows the application to crash? The other thing is this fuzzing usually gives you test cases that are very complex, and sometimes it helps to somehow reduce the complexity. So it could be that it's a huge picture that somehow triggers the bug, but maybe what you need is some kind of a very basic portion of it. And the smaller the test case is, the easier it is to understand for whoever needs to fix the bug, or for whoever you need to understand the really root cause of the bug, what the bug is about. So you can do this also automatically. Sometimes you can take the same test case that is crashing something, you remove some component, and then you check if it's crashing again. So again, you can be as smart as you want on these topics. There are entire research areas on how to optimize these topics. So there is no pretense of being, being a comprehensive overview. But again, this is at least a trend, a technique, an area, a direction that people have taken. And then you have this exploitability assessment. So bugs, let's say that there is a crash that is due to a security bug. Again, this doesn't mean that all these crashes or these security bugs are all more easily exploitable. Okay, there are situations in which, sure, there is a security bug, but then depending on the protection systems, then it's difficult to somehow exploit it. Okay, so if you have many of these, very great news. You maybe want to optimize depending on which one seems to be more exploitable. There are some drawbacks in fuzzing. Define bugs. The first one is that define bugs, but not only security bugs. So once a crash is found, you need to triage it. You need to understand whether it's a bug that is relevant for your security analysis. Again, there are many bugs that are just null dereferences, and in modern versions of operating systems, you cannot exploit them. So there is this cons. But once he finds a crash, well, at least you're crashing something. It's not, you have a false positive, like maybe it's a crash not due to a security bug, but it's still a crash. While there are other techniques like static analysis that we're going to see next time that sometimes have a very high false positive rate. And this false positive means that, the technique tells you there is a bug there, but there is nothing. There is not even a crash. Okay. So keep this in mind. The other big drawback is that, and it's huge, that it may not detect all the bugs. And there could be deep parts of the code that are difficult to reach with this kind of automatic and random test generation approach. So without the human telling the fuzzer, try to go in this specific direction, maybe it may be difficult for a fuzzer to automatically find randomly a test input that actually reached this point. The other important point is that even if the vulnerable code was reached during the test, it doesn't mean that the bug is going to be found, because maybe the test cases reached the problematic code, but it maybe did not trigger the corner case, so there was no crash. Or maybe the actual buffer, maybe there was a buffer overflow and the buffer was overflowed, but depending on how the things were set up, this does not directly lead to a crash, which again means that you're not going to find the bug there. Again, because the fuzzer somehow tries to understand whether there is a bug or not, depending on a crash, depending if there is a segmentation fault. If you don't have this signal, then the fuzzer may miss these results. These are the drawbacks to keep into account. Okay. Okay, so we're getting towards the end for this part. I have one slide for the story of the bug once you found and submitted. So once you actually find it, you submit it to Google, for example, and they triage it. So they try to understand the severity of it. They assign a severity score, and given the severity, the severity is going to influence the priority. Then they would work on a fix. Once they commit the fix, they would test it. Once they test it, then a patch is released as part of the next bulletin version. Again, this part is about Android. Different systems, different software has different patch release cycles. Then bug can be tracked via its CV number. For Android, this is usually assigned only for moderate or more critical bugs. And usually for moderate and more critical bugs, you get some money. I think usually if you have a moderate bug, you get $1,000 usually. Okay, so that's in one slide what happens once you find a bug and once you submit it. I have a couple of slides more on different aspects of these vulnerabilities, which is there are techniques to prevent these bugs in the first place. Okay, so and this is under the area of vulnerability prevention. One thing is to write code without bugs. Very easy to prevent bugs. Just don't have code with bugs. Of course, you can try your best, but bugs are always going to be there. One other technique is to write code in memory safe languages. This is great, and there is a good trend. People are start using languages like Rust or Go, which somehow eliminate many of these memory related problems. And they are not as dangerous as in C++. Many people use Python, Java, and so forth. These languages are not affected by many of these memory safety problems that C and C++ programs are affected by. Unfortunately, there are still huge components like the big part of the Android framework, Linux kernel, and so forth, written in C and C++. So we're going to be stuck with the C++ and potentially memory safe problems for a long time. Okay, but again, it's a trend to use memory safe languages. The other things is to use protections that are compiler assisted. There are a number of protections that are somehow inserted once you compile the piece of code. Again, these are huge research trends. And for example, this integer overflow sanitization is a technique that is implemented as part of as a compiler plugin. Once you compile a piece of code, somehow the compiler, once it compiles the code, tries to check whether there is potential integer overflow, and it puts extra checks so that if this problematic path is triggered, then it would crash. Okay. Then you have control flow integrity. Again, there are hundreds of papers on this control flow integrity, and these are just random names. You're not supposed to know what they mean, but they're just to say there is a huge trend in trying to find protections that are applicable at the compilation time. There are also techniques that, again, in the mindset of preventing vulnerability, that basically once you compile the application, then you can test it, but you test the application which is slightly modified, so that once you fuzz it, you're going to find that there is a memory buffer overflow, even if maybe the application doesn't crash. So without this technique, basically it could be that you somehow go over a buffer and you overflow it, but for some reason the application doesn't crash. Okay, because maybe you overflow the buffer, but maybe there is another buffer. You're not going to overflow some memory related part, but it could be that with the bigger overflow, you may reach sensitive things. Okay. Now, if you don't have advanced things, you're going to miss this crash. This is not going to crash, so you're going to miss it. from the fuzzing perspective. But there are techniques like address sanitizer and other techniques where basically they add some instrumentation so that the moment you try to overflow this buffer, they're going to crash intentionally. Okay, and this is going to signal to the fuzzer that, hey, I found something. Okay, so sometimes you compile programs with these techniques. Again, these are sometimes compiler passes, and with the idea that that then you can fuzz these modified versions, and it's easier for a memory-related problems, for example, to trigger a crash, which helps the fuzzer noticing the problem. And the last aspect is that there is a huge trend that tries to use fuzzing as part of the release cycle. So whenever you have a new version of some product, then you fuzz it, and you don't release it until you have fuzzed it for many hours. Okay. So there is this kind of a big community effort of introducing fuzzing as part of the release cycle, and of course this increases the possibility that the code with bugs is not even shipped, okay? Because this would happen before you actually release the code, okay? So there's some notes on how you can prevent bugs or techniques to prevent bugs. There is another category of protections that is not about preventing the bug per se, the existence of the bug per se, but it's about preventing the exploitation or the potential of exploitation of these bugs, okay? So these techniques do not remove the bug, but makes the exploitation impossible or more difficult. And I'm sure there are two examples that you are already familiar with from, I guess, the system security class. For example, stack canaries or cookies, where basically you put something random at the end of the buffer, and then before the code returns and use the return address, it checks that this number is the same as the one that was before. And again, this doesn't remove the buffer overflow, but it makes the exploitation of it more difficult. Another example is address space layout randomization, where basically this doesn't remove the buffer overflow bug, but somehow makes it more difficult for the attacker to know, hey, what kind of address should I overwrite the return address with to then jump to my own code? It's more difficult because maybe you don't know where the code is, and you may need another bug to somehow break ASLR, okay? So again, this list is very far from being comprehensive, but I just want to convey that, there are a research trend on preventing bugs and preventing the exploitation. So don't remove the bugs, but they prevent that they can be exploited, which is, also valuable, okay? All right. And then I think, yes, this is the last slide for this topic. There is the last trend that I'm aware of is the detection of exploitation. So one thing is, you try your best to have code without bugs, and then you try your best to make it as difficult as possible to exploit these bugs, even if these bugs are there. And then the last step is, okay, let's say that attackers are being able to exploit bugs that are in the code. Can we at least detect that somebody is exploiting something? And that's where the honeypots kick in. So honeypots are basically devices that are left unintentionally vulnerable, and usually they are accessible on the internet, so that you wait and see if somebody is actually attacking it. And if somebody is attacking them, you try to see how they're being attacked, okay? So again, this is, this intentionally vulnerable is when you already know there is a bug. So maybe you discover the bug and you want to see if somebody is exploiting it. Well, you leave a device down around, and you hope that somebody, you try to see if an attacker is exploiting it. And this device is actually modified, or maybe it's not even real, it's simulated, and you try to track whether the attacker is actually exploiting it or not, okay? And at least you know, okay, the attacker is exploiting it. This becomes more serious. And there is a last interesting trick, which is called Oni tokens. For these honeypots, this is not only used to understand if a bug is exploited, but it's also used in the area of malware analysis, okay? You leave something there, it could be exploitable, but you want to know how malware exploits it and what the malware does after it's exploited, okay? So these honeypots is not only relevant, of course, for this detection of exploitation, it's also studying about malware families and so forth. The last aspect I want to mention is this Oni tokens, which is relatively recent. Again, not yesterday, but not even 20 years ago. The idea is that you take your code and you insert strings, domain names, resources that act as traps for the attacker. So you put a string that is not really useful or used by the application, but it is that maybe you put some kind of weird domain name, and maybe the attacker that wants to is reading and trying to reverse engineer your code. What it does is to it's a weird domain name. Let me see if there is a website on it, and then maybe it goes to this website, or maybe Google for this website. And you, as a defender, can monitor if there is a DNS request to this domain name, or you can monitor whether maybe, if you Google for this domain, maybe this links to Google is going to return a result that is a specific page, and then you can track whether somebody is visiting this specific page. And you can set it up in a way that this page is going to be returned by Google only if somebody Googles for this specific term. So that you know that if somebody visited your page, it means that this somebody actually was analyzing your app, taking this domain name and Googling for it, or taking these specific strings and Googling for it. Okay, so that's a way to somehow understand whether you have somebody that is taking your piece of code, your application, and is actively reverse engineering it. Again, this is not about detection or exploitation. It's more about detecting that somebody is reverse engineering your application. Depending on the context, could be useful. Okay. So it just so at least you know that if you have a big layer of obfuscation, and now you have evidence that somebody is able to read unclear things or things that are unclear only after you defeat the obfuscation. Now you know that somebody has defeated obfuscation, so maybe it's time to change obfuscation type, to buy a new product, and so forth. Okay. And the last interesting note is that these tricks are actually used by malware as well. Malware authors sometimes want to understand whether a malware sample has been identified by a security researcher, and they want to understand whether maybe the obfuscation, the packing techniques have been dealt with by the security researcher. Okay, and it's tricky, right? Because I find maybe this malware, somehow there is a link to a domain name, and maybe this malware will never use it for real, because maybe there is some check that would never bring the code to actually go there. But maybe me as a security researcher sees a domain, oh, yeah, let me check this domain. And then I contact it, bam. The attacker may be monitoring the DNS request, now knows that some security researchers around the world defeated the obfuscation and is about to understand what the malware is doing. And maybe that's a signal for the bad guys to say, okay, maybe I should change something. Okay. So I think is a great idea, this kind of putting traps around that, if you see this trap, this string, it means that you're already at this point and it somehow leaks information to the attacker or to the defender. I think it's a great idea. Okay, so that's about it for this topic. And I'm going to see you soon in the next Deco slide. Bye.